The morning sun filtered through the blinds as David Carter took his first sip of coffee, relishing the quiet start to the day. He had grown to love the simple pleasure of tending to his vegetable garden, a sanctuary he had carefully cultivated over the years. But as he stepped outside onto his front porch, his breath caught in his throat. 3 massive bulldozers were lined up at the edge of his driveway, their engines idling menacingly. Standing in front of them, with arms crossed and a smug smile curling her lips, was Margaret Doyle, the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, HOA. Beside her, flipping through a stack of legal papers, was Thomas Grant, the HOA's legal counsel. David's grip tightened around his coffee mug. Something wasn't right. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Margaret called out, her voice laced with condescension. "I assume you've been informed." David stepped forward cautiously. "Informed about what?" Margaret let out a theatrical sigh as if dealing with an unruly child. "You are in direct violation of HOA regulations. Your so-called garden is an unauthorized agricultural activity, and per our bylaws, it must be removed immediately." David felt a surge of irritation, but kept his voice calm. "Margaret, we've been over this. My property predates the HOA's formation, and I have exemptions. You can't just show up with bulldozers." Margaret raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. "That's where you're mistaken." She turned to Thomas, who adjusted his glasses and spoke in a clipped tone. "The board held an emergency meeting last night and deemed your violations severe enough to warrant immediate action. Under Section 9.3 of the HOA Charter, we have the right to enforce compliance by any means necessary." David's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about his garden, this was personal. His neighbors had begun to gather on the sidewalks, drawn by the sight of the heavy machinery and the heated exchange. Some whispered nervously, others recorded on their phones. But no one dared to intervene. Margaret had ruled the HOA with an iron fist for years, issuing fines, enforcing absurd rules, and bullying anyone who dared question her authority. David took a slow, measured breath. "Margaret, I suggest you check your legal standing before you make a very costly mistake." Margaret's smile widened. "Oh, David, you don't seem to understand. There is no mistake." At her signal, the bulldozer operators revved their engines, the deep rumbling vibrating through the ground. Dust swirled into the air, and a creeping sense of dread coiled in David's gut. His heart pounded. They were actually going to do it. Before he could react, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Stop! This is illegal!" Everyone turned as Helen Marshall, an elderly woman with a cane and a fire in her eyes, pushed through the crowd. She had lived in Oak Ridge since long before the HOA existed, and despite her frail appearance, she was one of the few people who hadn't been intimidated by Margaret's reign of terror. David felt a flicker of hope as Helen jabbed a gnarled finger toward Margaret. "This land, David's land, is protected. I was there when his father signed the original agreements. You know it. And yet here you are, breaking the law in broad daylight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the bulldozer operators hesitated, shifting in their seats. Margaret's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Mrs. Marshall," she said smoothly, "perhaps you should sit down. This matter doesn't concern you." Helen let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, but it does, because you've done this before." David glanced at Helen in surprise. But before he could ask what she meant, Margaret clapped her hands twice. "Enough delays," she snapped. "Proceed." The nearest bulldozer lurched forward. David felt his pulse spike. If they touched his garden, his home, it would be war. He whipped out his phone, hitting record as he took a step toward Margaret. "If you go through with this," he said, voice steel, "you're going to regret it." Margaret met his stare, her blue eyes cold and calculating. "We'll see about that." The engines roared. The crowd held its breath. And David knew this was just the beginning. David Carter sat at his kitchen table, the bright orange violation notice spread out in front of him like an open wound. His mind replayed the scene from that morning, the bulldozers, the smug satisfaction in Margaret Doyle's voice, the way his neighbors had watched but remained silent. Something about this felt different, more targeted than just another petty HOA dispute. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. What was Margaret really after? His phone buzzed, the screen flashing with an incoming call. Helen Marshall. "David!" Her voice crackled through the speaker. "We need to talk, now!" David checked the time. It was already past sunset, but there was an urgency in her tone that sent a ripple of unease through him. "I'll be right over." Helen's house had always been one of the oldest in the neighborhood, a quaint little place with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with faded photographs of a time long before Oak Ridge Estates became a gated community. When David arrived, she was already waiting at the door, her hands trembling slightly as she motioned him inside. "They've been watching you, David," she said, locking the door behind them. David frowned. "Who? Margaret?" Helen shook her head. "Not just her, the HOA, the people behind it." She reached for an old wooden box on her coffee table, her fingers brushing over it like she was handling something dangerous. "This isn't just about your garden," she continued, lifting the lid. "This goes way back, to the very foundation of this neighborhood." Inside the box were documents, yellowed with age, some with faded signatures, others stamped with official-looking seals. David picked up the top sheet and scanned the text. Land agreements, sale contracts, development plans from decades ago. His breath hitched when he saw one familiar name printed in bold letters. Carter Family Land, Purchase Agreement 1973. David's head snapped up. This is my family's land." Helen nodded. "Your father sold most of it to developers, but there were conditions in that sale. He retained certain rights, things the HOA doesn't want anyone to remember." David flipped through the documents feverishly. His father had signed over the surface property to developers, but in return, he had retained the mineral rights, the easement rights, and, most importantly, legal immunity from any future homeowners association. David's stomach dropped. "Margaret knew," he whispered. Helen leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't just know. She's been trying to erase that history." David's mind reeled. If this was true, then the HOA had no legal control over his property at all. They had no authority to fine him, dictate what he could do with his land, or send bulldozers to destroy his garden. So why were they trying so hard? "What does Margaret stand to gain?" David asked, but deep down, he already knew the answer. Helen pulled another paper from the box, this one much newer. A recent HOA financial statement listing expenses and legal fees. David's eyes trailed down the page until they stopped on a suspiciously large payment, one made just last month. $75,000, legal consultation and developmental planning. Recipient, Doyle and Grant Holdings, LLC. David felt a chill creep up his spine. "Doyle and Grant," he murmured. Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Margaret and Thomas. They've been using the HOA as a front. That money? It's not for legal fees. They're planning something big." David's fists clenched. His father's land, the one thing that stood in their way. Suddenly, a loud knock at the front door made them both freeze. Helen's eyes widened in alarm. "Did you tell anyone you were coming here?" David shook his head. The knock came again, louder, more urgent. Helen grabbed his arm, her fingers like steel. "Go out the back, now." David hesitated, but the look in her eyes made him listen. He shoved the documents into his jacket and slipped through the back door, moving quietly but quickly through the small backyard. Just as he reached the side fence, he heard the front door creak open. A deep voice, one he recognized immediately. Thomas Grant. "We know he's here, Helen," Thomas said, his tone silky and dangerous. "Why don't you save us all some time?" David's pulse pounded in his ears. They knew, and now they were coming for him. David Carter barely slept that night. The moment he had escaped from Helen's house, his world had shifted. The documents in his possession were more than just historical records. They were proof that Margaret Doyle and Thomas Grant were orchestrating something far bigger than petty HOA violations. They wanted his land, and now that he knew the truth, he was in serious danger. By dawn, David was seated in his dimly lit study. The documents spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle. His father's old land deeds, the mineral rights clause, the immunity from HOA governance. It was all here. But what unsettled him most was that someone had deliberately tried to bury this information. He needed more. Helen had given him a lead the night before, a suspicious payment of $75,000 made by the HOA to Doyle and Grant Holdings, LLC. If Margaret and Thomas were funneling money through shell companies, then there had to be more, much more. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his laptop and began digging. A trail of corruption. An hour later, David hit gold. Buried in the county's public records database, he found a series of unusual transactions spanning the past 5 years, payments disguised as community improvements, but with no actual work completed. $150,000 for park enhancements, yet the park remained unchanged. $80,000 for road resurfacing, despite potholes still lining the streets. And the biggest one yet, $300,000 for a pool renovation that never happened. David's hands clenched into fists. The money had all been siphoned into Doyle and Grant Holdings, LLC. Margaret and Thomas had been embezzling HOA funds for years, forcing residents to pay excessive fees for projects that never existed. And now they were trying to force him out. His blood ran cold as he realized why. They weren't just after his garden, they wanted his entire property. The first warning, David barely had time to process the revelation when his phone buzzed with a blocked number. He hesitated before answering. "Carter!" A slow, measured voice oozed through the speaker. "I suggest you stop digging." David's grip tightened. "Who is this?" A low chuckle. "Someone who doesn't want you to make a mistake you can't take back." David's pulse pounded. "If this is Margaret, you think this is just about her?" The voice sharpened. "Margaret is just the beginning. You have no idea who you're dealing with." A cold chill crept down David's spine. Whoever this was, they were watching him. The call went dead. David sat frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, he glanced toward the window. Across the street, a black SUV sat parked under the shade of an old oak tree. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see inside, but David knew someone was in there watching him. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore, it was war, a break-in and a race against time. Determined to act before Margaret could retaliate, David grabbed his car keys and headed towards City Hall, where all original property records were kept. He drove cautiously, keeping an eye on the SUV in his rearview mirror. But by the time he reached the records office, the vehicle had disappeared. Inside the county clerk's office was quiet, the smell of old paper thick in the air. He found Martha Reynolds, the head records clerk, and handed her his documents. "These are from my father's original sale," he said. "I need to confirm they're still legally binding." Martha adjusted her glasses, flipping through the papers with growing concern. "Mr. Carter, if these documents are accurate, then your property should be entirely exempt from the HOA." David nodded. "Exactly, but Margaret Doyle is trying to bury that fact. Can you pull up any recent amendments to the HOA's charter?" Martha frowned and began typing into her system. After a moment, her expression darkened. "Well, that's interesting." She turned the monitor toward him. David's stomach dropped. Less than 2 weeks ago, Margaret and Thomas had filed a new HOA provision, giving them the right to seize properties deemed abandoned or non-compliant with community standards. David's throat went dry. "They're planning to take my house," he whispered. Martha hesitated, then glanced around before leaning in. "Mr. Carter, someone else came looking for these same records yesterday." David's blood ran cold. "Who?" Martha swallowed. "A man in a dark suit. He never gave a name, but he left in a hurry after I told him I had to retrieve the older files from storage." David's mind raced. Someone knew what he was doing, and they were trying to get ahead of him. He stood abruptly. "I need copies of everything, right now." Martha nodded, quickly printing out stacks of documents. As she handed them to him, she whispered, "Be careful, Mr. Carter. Whatever this is, it's bigger than you think." The cost of the truth. David hurried back to his car, stuffing the documents into his bag. But as he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. He hesitated, then answered, "You just made a very big mistake." The line went dead. And then, before David could react, his car exploded. The blast threw him backward, his ears ringing as flames engulfed the vehicle. People screamed, alarms blared. David coughed, trying to blink through the smoke. His head pounded, his hands trembled. This wasn't a warning anymore. They had just tried to kill him. And now David knew whoever was behind this wasn't just stealing money. They were willing to destroy lives to keep their secret. As sirens wailed in the distance, he made a silent vow. They wanted him gone, but they had just made their biggest mistake. David wasn't backing down. David Carter stood in the wreckage of his burnt-out car, the acrid scent of charred metal still thick in the air. Firefighters had put out the flames, but the message was clear. Whoever was behind this wanted him gone, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. Instead of scaring him away, they had lit a fire in him. David clenched his fists. If they were willing to kill for this, then whatever Margaret and Thomas were hiding was bigger than he imagined. And now he was going to expose it. A dangerous confrontation. 2 nights later, David walked into the Oak Ridge Community Hall, his bag slung over his shoulder. The HOA had called an emergency meeting, and he knew exactly what it was about. Margaret wasn't just trying to silence him, she was trying to destroy him publicly. The room was packed with residents, their whispers filling the air with a restless energy. At the front of the room sat Margaret, her perfectly ironed blazer stiff with authority, and beside her Thomas Grant, flipping through a stack of legal documents. David could feel their eyes on him, cold and calculating. They thought they had won. They were wrong. Margaret stood, clearing her throat. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Unfortunately, we have a serious issue to address." She turned to face David, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Mr. Carter, it has come to the board's attention that your property has been found in severe violation of community standards. Not only does your illegal garden remain non-compliant, but we have also discovered significant discrepancies in your property's legal standing." David leaned against the nearest chair, arms crossed. "Discrepancies?" he repeated. "That's an interesting word choice." Thomas interjected smoothly. "After conducting a thorough review, the HOA has determined that your exemptions no longer apply due to recent policy updates. Under the new HOA Development Ordinance, your land is now subject to HOA regulations." David almost laughed. They were trying to rewrite history. Before he could respond, Margaret continued, "With that in mind, we are presenting a formal motion to seize your property for failure to comply with community standards, effective immediately." The room erupted in gasps. David felt the weight of every eye on him. The HOA was trying to make an example of him, to show the community that no one could stand against them. He took a slow breath, then calmly reached into his bag. "Since we're talking about property rights," he said, pulling out a thick stack of papers, "I thought I'd bring some documents of my own." Margaret's eyes narrowed. David placed the papers on the table. "This," he said, tapping the top page, "is the original 1973 property agreement signed by my father and the developers of Oak Ridge Estates. According to this legally binding document, my property, along with 4 others, is permanently exempt from HOA jurisdiction." The murmurs grew louder. David turned to Thomas. "I believe you argued that my exemptions were void." He slid another paper forward. "This is the county's official recognition of those rights, filed last week." "My land is untouchable. Your rules don't apply to me." Thomas's jaw tightened. He rifled through his own documents, searching for a way out. Margaret's voice cut through the rising tension. "Regardless of outdated agreements, the HOA has the right to—" "No," David interrupted, his voice like steel. "You don't." He pulled out one final document, a financial statement showing the missing $300,000. Silence fell. The crowd shifted uneasily as David stepped forward. "This," he said, raising the paper, "is a record of every illegal transaction the HOA has made over the past 5 years." He turned to the audience. "Did you ever wonder why our HOA fees kept going up? Why we were charged for community projects that never actually happened?" Murmurs turned to outrage. David slammed the paper onto the table. "Because Margaret and Thomas have been stealing from you." Margaret's expression remained frozen, but David saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. David pulled out one final sheet, the registration documents for Doyle and Grant Holdings, LLC. The crowd gasped as they saw the listed owners. Margaret Doyle, Thomas Grant. "Every stolen dollar," David continued, "has gone directly into a company they secretly own." The room erupted. "Is this true?" someone shouted. "Where's our money, Margaret?" another voice demanded. Margaret's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She turned to Thomas, her voice tight. "Fix this." But Thomas looked visibly shaken. He was out of moves. David took a step closer. He wasn't done. "I know what you've been planning," he said. "You're not just stealing money. You've been targeting residents, forcing them to sell their homes at below market value so you can flip them for a profit." A hush fell over the room. Margaret's composure snapped. "This is ridiculous. We have every right to enforce—" David cut her off. "You have no rights. Not anymore." At that moment, the double doors at the back of the hall burst open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Margaret turned pale. Sheriff Martinez strode forward, his eyes locked on her. "Ms. Doyle, Mr. Grant, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit property theft." The room exploded into chaos as the sheriff produced a warrant. Margaret whipped around, panic flashing across her face. "You can't do this! I built this neighborhood!" David met her gaze with calm certainty. "You tried to destroy me," he said. "Now it's your turn." As Margaret and Thomas were escorted away, the residents began to cheer. For the first time in years, the HOA had lost. And David? He had just won the first battle. Margaret Doyle had spent years building her empire, but in the span of one night, it had begun to crumble beneath her feet. David Carter stood at the front of the Oak Ridge Community Hall, the cheers of his neighbors still ringing in his ears as Margaret and Thomas were led out in handcuffs. But he knew this wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning of the real fight. The fallout begins. The next morning, David woke up to the sound of pounding at his front door. He opened it to find Helen Marshall, her face pale but determined. "They're still trying to cover their tracks," she said, thrusting a manila folder into his hands. David flipped it open and felt his stomach tighten. Inside were copies of emergency fund transfers, money being funneled from the HOA's accounts into offshore holdings. And it was happening right now. "They're moving the money before law enforcement can seize it," Helen said. "If we don't act fast, they'll disappear before facing justice." David didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and called Sheriff Martinez. "You need to freeze those accounts," he said. "Now." The sheriff didn't ask questions. "Consider it done." But even as David hung up, he had the unsettling feeling that Margaret wasn't going down without a final move. Margaret's last stand. That night, as David was reviewing more documents, his security cameras pinged. He pulled up the feed, and his blood ran cold. A black car had pulled up outside his house. The engine idled for a long moment before the back door swung open. Margaret Doyle stepped out. David's fingers hovered over his phone, ready to call the police. But then he saw something that made his skin crawl. She was smiling, calm, confident, like she still had the upper hand. Moments later, his doorbell rang. David opened it just enough to see her standing there, her expensive suit unruffled, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Well, David," she said, her voice smooth, "I have to admit, you put up quite a fight." David crossed his arms. "The fight's over, Margaret. You lost." Margaret tilted her head. "Did I?" She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "I thought I'd come by and offer you a deal." David didn't move. "I'm not interested," she sighed. "Oh, but you haven't even heard what it is." She held up the USB, letting it dangle between her fingers. "This," she said, "contains information you'd find very useful. The names of every official I've ever paid off, including a few in the sheriff's office, judges, city planners, people you'd never suspect." David's eyes narrowed. "And what, you're offering to hand it over if I let you walk away?" Margaret smiled. "Oh no, dear, I'm offering you a choice." She stepped closer. "You can take this and bury it. Walk away. Go back to your little garden and live in peace. No more threats, no more danger." David held her gaze. "And if I don't?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Then everyone you care about will pay the price." The words hung in the air like poison. David exhaled slowly, then did something Margaret did not expect. He laughed. Margaret blinked. "Something funny?" David leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Yeah. You still think you have control." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and turned the screen toward her. The live feed from his security camera showed Margaret's smug little speech, being recorded in crystal clear HD. Margaret's face drained of colour. "You see, Margaret," David said, "I learned something important these past few weeks. You never negotiate with a cornered animal." The sound of sirens cut through the night. Margaret turned sharply as police cars rounded the corner, their lights flashing. David stepped back, arms crossed as Sheriff Martinez and his deputies stormed up the walkway. Margaret's hands curled into fists, her carefully constructed mask of control finally cracking. "You played the wrong game," David said softly. Margaret spun on her heel, trying to flee, but two officers blocked her path. As they cuffed her wrists, she glared at David with pure hatred. "You think you've won," she hissed. David didn't answer. He simply watched as the officers dragged her away, her final desperate words lost beneath the wail of sirens. The HOA's final collapse. In the days that followed, the scandal exploded. News outlets picked up the story, residents came forward with more complaints, and authorities launched a full-scale investigation into the Oak Ridge HOA. With Margaret and Thomas both behind bars, the HOA was dissolved in a landslide vote. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. Helen approached David on the morning of the final vote, a warm smile on her face. "You did it," she said softly. David glanced at the plot of land that once held his garden. It had been torn up, trampled, and nearly erased, but he would rebuild. No one would ever take it from him again. "We all did," he said, looking out at his neighbours, who stood together not in fear, but in unity. Margaret had tried to control them with power. David had won by giving them back their voice. And that was something no HOA would ever take away again. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Oak Ridge Estates, or rather what was left of the once oppressive HOA regime. The air felt lighter, almost charged with something new. Freedom, change, a future no longer dictated by fear. David Carter stood at the edge of his yard, where his garden once thrived, before being torn apart by Margaret's orders. But tonight, it would bloom again. One by one, his neighbours arrived, some carrying shovels, others bringing seedlings and bags of fresh soil. Even those who had once stayed silent in fear now stood beside him, ready to rebuild. It had started as a fight over a garden, but in the end, it became a battle for something much greater. Helen Marshall, cane in hand, walked up to David and placed a small tomato plant in his hands. "Figured you should plant the first one," she said with a knowing smile. David chuckled, kneeling down and digging his hands into the soil. The same soil his father had once owned, the same land they had tried to take from him. As he planted the seedling, a murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just a symbol of victory, it was a declaration. No one would ever control them again. A new beginning. The weeks that followed saw radical change. The corrupt HOA board was officially dissolved. The stolen funds were recovered, and plans for a fair, community-led group replaced the dictatorship that had ruled over them for so long. For the first time in years, the people of Oak Ridge had a voice, and they used it. No more ridiculous fines, no more bullying and intimidation. Instead, neighbors came together, making decisions as equals. It wasn't just about rules and regulations, it was about trust. It was about choosing to stand up, even when it was easier to stay silent. A lesson for all of us that night, as David sat on his porch looking out over his freshly planted garden, he thought about how easily power could be abused. How a handful of people had manipulated an entire community until one person refused to back down. And the truth is, this isn't just a story about a neighborhood, it's about all of us. Think about it. How often do we see unfair rules, corrupt leaders, or people in power who abuse their authority? How many times do we convince ourselves that someone else will stand up? But what if that someone was you? David didn't set out to be a hero, he just wanted to grow his garden. But when they tried to take everything from him, he made a choice. And maybe one day you'll have to make that choice too. So what would you do? Would you let them bulldoze over you, or would you stand your ground? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, stories of standing up, fighting back, and rewriting the rules, hit that subscribe button. Because here at The Story Forge, we tell the stories that remind us all. Sometimes the fight is worth it.